Thank you very much for having us here today. I'm briefed on behalf of the Johannesburg Attorneys Association. I'll tell you briefly what the organization is about. They're the largest voluntary organization to represent attorneys in Johannesburg and represent over 2,500 members of all races. And our submission will deal with a number of points. Firstly, we want to emphasize that as lawyers, we care deeply about justice. And one of the most important parts of justice is restoring past wrongs. And so we emphasize this importance of land restitution. The idea that if your land was stolen from you, it ought to be restored to you, and that any just society must have a compensatory mechanism in place to ensure that the justice of the past are righted. So that is our starting point. We will then turn to look at the scope of the inquiry before this committee and what powers it has to recommend any possible changes to the Constitution. We will then briefly discuss what the international law is on the area of expropriation without compensation. And we'll raise a number of concerns that may be present if the Constitution were to be amended, and then finally end with a couple of solutions. So firstly, with regards to the scope of the inquiry, this committee has done a tour of the country and asked the public and a number of organizations to present submissions for a narrow question. That narrow question is, should the Constitution be changed to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation? Now, Section 25 of our Constitution deals with a much broader category being property. This means that no recommendation could be made to change anything in the property clause of the Constitution that would interfere with any property rights whatsoever, except for land, because of the narrowness of this inquiry. With regards to international law, so South Africa was a founding member of the United Nations, and there are a number of different treaties in place and in customary international law which deal with this question of what powers states have to expropriate land. Now, firstly, expropriation is one of those things that is going to be necessary for states to use. In other words, if you're going to engage in building public infrastructure, something like a Gautrain project or building roads, it'll often be necessary to go through privately held land, and a seller may not want to sell, and therefore the state will have to expropriate. What international law says is that you must pay adequate compensation. Now, if we removed a requirement of compensation in our Constitution, in other words, if no compensation was offered for the case of land, this would be a flouting of international law. So these are the two sort of concerns that we have. So with regards to some of the other concerns that must be taken into account, the first is with regards to how much money has been dedicated towards this process of land reform and land restitution. So if we look at the most recent budget, we see that only 0.3% of the budget has been dedicated towards this important process of land reform. The amount is roughly 5.6 billion rand, which is basically a rounding error when we look at the entirety of the budget, which is roughly 1.3 trillion rand. So if this is a concern for South Africans, and this is the hottest issue in public discourse at the moment, then it is incumbent upon government to dedicate the correct amount of resources to it. In other words, the way to solve this problem is to ensure that those people who have had their land taken away from them are given adequate compensation, and that those people that need adequate housing are addressed in that regard. And one way to do that is to increase the budget. The other thing that must be taken into account is the real interests of South Africans. So if we look at polling that has been done by the South African Institute for Race Relations, we see that when South Africans are asked, what are the major issues for you, what are your primary concerns, first of all, they list unemployment. That figure of concern is close to 40%. Then it's service delivery at around 33%. Access to water, access to basic shelter. Right at the bottom is land redistribution, which comes in their latest survey at 2%. So we know that when we're looking at the hierarchy of issues, when we need to prioritize things, that this does come towards the bottom of people's needs. So that must be taken into account before something so drastic as changing the Bill of Rights occurs. We must remember that in the entire history of our Constitution, which has been amended 17 times, the Bill of Rights has never been amended. The Bill of Rights is one of the most sacred portions of our Constitution, and I think we ought to have enormous pause before amending the Bill of Rights, especially when there are other measures that can be done. Next, I think we must, while recognizing that restitution is important, the mechanism that's used to do that restitution matters enormously. And we must bear in mind the needs of all South Africans and the damage that can be done by using certain mechanisms. So the concern with expropriating property without compensation is that you undermine a very important right. And if we look at the economic devastation that has occurred around the world from states that have tried this before, we find that it's not only to those that held land, it's to the entire population. So if we look at what's happened to our neighbor in the north in Zimbabwe, if we look at what's happened in Venezuela, we see in Venezuela, for example, that one of the most prosperous countries in South America has been rendered a basket case, that people are fleeing the country in droves. To give you an example of this, there's a famous picture of police arresting someone who's got these white bags of powder on him. And you say, oh, it's South America, it must be bags of cocaine. Actually, he's being arrested because he has bags of flour. And the state says, you cannot use this flour for your own purposes. This is state flour. You cannot bake your own bread. And they have mass starvation in Venezuela because they have so dramatically interfered with property rights there. So the signal that will be sent to the international community as well as one is, as an international investor, you can invest in any part of the world. You don't have to pick South Africa. And someone that acts in their own self-interest would want to invest in a country where their land rights are secure. So as much as there is a noble end here, which is to ensure that there is greater access to land and that those that have had their land stolen from them are properly compensated, the mechanism may be much worse. We don't want medicine that's worse than the poison. We must also recognize that farming is a highly technical job. That government, in a recent case, bought up 264 farms in the Eastern Cape for the purposes of redistribution towards new farmers. And only 26 of those farms are still fully functioning, so 10%, which means a 90% failure rate. If you're going to have redress, if you're going to hand people land, you need to do so in a manner which is sustainable. Farming is sort of become a much more scientific process over time, and that must be recognized, that if what you want is sustainable development, handing over the land is insufficient for that. You require their own expertise and other access to resources. So with regards to solutions, what we can look at is what has been done thus far. So between 1995 and 2014, 1.8 million individuals have received compensation for land that was taken from them in the land claims court process. 1.8 million individuals is a large number. And we know that 92% of those individuals elected to take money instead of land. And one of the reasons is because money is fungible. Money is freedom. Money means that you're not stuck in a rural area having to learn how to farm. You can use that money to start a business, to pay off your debts, to invest. So that's important. And this is a solution that can be used for remaining claims, which is to use the existing land claims process. The other thing that many other people have said is that you ought to be conferring title. So those people that have been occupying land for a long period of time with the uncertainty of whether they'll be able to remain there should be granted title deeds. The importance of title is that it's transferable. You can borrow against it. So we need to have more security of title over land as opposed to less. The other thing is to use the current constitutional powers that are in place in Section 25. So we know from the case law that the first point that you look at is what the market value of the land is, but then you can deviate up and down based on the other powers. So for example, the history of acquisition is one of those things that's currently mentioned in our Constitution. So if you have land that was taken by the barrel of a gun, that is going to be a very good reason for reducing compensation, possibly down to 0 rands. You can also look at the purpose of the expropriation. If the purpose of the expropriation is to benefit people that are in need of land, that's going to play a role in determining what price is ultimately paid. And finally, that the use of the property is also going to play a value in the price. So I would say that the Constitution in its current form provides ample powers to government, and that must be taken into account. Before I conclude, just as a matter of how to engage with questions, we are very happy to engage with questions. I would just ask if it's possible for them to be on a one-to-one basis so that I can answer each one coherently, as opposed to taking a round of questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we cannot grant you a different approach to other presenters. So you'll just have to bear with us. Yes. Members, Honorable Swart, Honorable Lotrit, Honorable Mukwele, Honorable Filtane, and lastly, Honorable Smith. In that order, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the helpful submission. I would just like to ask you, in view of the possible breaches of our international law obligations, where you mentioned the owner shall be paid appropriate compensation in terms of the resolution on permanent sovereignty over natural resources of the United Nations. Should we be in breach of our international obligations, can economic sanctions be applied to a member state in such circumstances? That's the first question. Secondly, in view of your submission, you indicate that Section 25, as it is presently formulated, you say there will be situations where no compensation is due after expropriation. Is that your position? And in other words, are you supporting, so are you saying that it's necessary to amend the Constitution or not necessary? That's the second issue. And then, because you are also, as lawyers, we've had various lawyers that are saying that it is necessary to amend the Constitution for clarity's sake. Would you not suggest that a Constitutional Court test case be brought to give clarity as to the parameters of Section 25 as it presently stands, given the doubt that exists, and some members of the committee are saying we need to amend the Constitution to bring clarity? Is it not, would that not be an easier step to go to the court and let the court give clarity so everybody knows what the position is? Thank you so much.
There are three questions there, if it's available for me to answer the three, because they are reasonably complicated.
So, Johannesburg Attorneys, you are going to listen to all the questions. Né? Please note what they are saying and then respond.
Chair, could I just remind the presenter that if there's not enough time, you can supplement through the chair, supplement in writing if necessary as well.
Yes. Okay. Honorable Lotrit.
Thank you, Chairperson. Also, thank you for the presentation. I also want to ask a question on the international law. You did say that we would be flouting international law if adequate compensation is not paid. Could you just expand a bit more on your understanding of, in terms of international law, what adequate would be vis-a-vis just an equitable compensation as is foreseen within the Constitution, and what you would think would happen within the international context should we make a case that it could be zero? Thank you.
Now, Honorable Filtane, or it's Mukwele.
Thank you very much, Chair. In your presentation, page 5 of it, under section reason not to amend the Constitution, you did mention that the country has a dark history of land theft. In your case as a lawyer, how do you deal with something that was stolen? Do you normally buy a stolen property? Or how do you deal with it? If I come to your court and then I accuse Honorable Chair for stealing my pen, Honorable Louis, for stealing my pen, do I have to compensate him for doing that, for stealing my property? And again, in your presentation, I think I just received your presentation, I just browsed through it. But I think, yeah, in page 6 of it, you did mention of failed programs of expropriation of land, of which, according, if we have time, I will tell you that those projects, they didn't fail. It is the system that made them to fail. Now, why always you do mention Zimbabwe and Venezuela, but you don't tell us about the positive projects, like, for example, Mozambique? Why do you always mention those ones? Do you have an intention of misleading the country or misleading the world that if ever the amendment of the constitution will happen in South Africa, it means will be as Venezuela and as Mozambique, rather Zimbabwe. Thirdly, you did mention that 92% of people that were compensated during the land redistribution decided to take cash. In your analysis, as the status quo of the country, how can you give a legal perspective to that? Why these poor people decided to take cash? One, is it because they took cash because of the poverty-stricken environment that they are living in? Two, did they took cash because the environment couldn't enable them to do whatever activity that they can do, be it in the land that were given to them, like to farm or to build property for selling or to do any other thing? Don't you think that the environment didn't enable them to do that? Three, you said the last question. The last question, but I must ask him questions, Chair.
No, I know, but
Yeah,
you know,
last question.
you are not being oppressed. It's only
Last
your
question,
freedom
Chair.
is-
You are
is
wasting
unlimited.
time yourself.
Okay.
I'm asking
Please-
him
please just,
according to the thing. Last question that I want to ask you is that you did mention that our people are moving from the poor rural areas. Let me tell you, our areas, our villages are not poor, are very rich. The reason why they moved from where they were relocated by the Group Areas Act is because they are moving because they were put on a barren land. That is why they are moving to towns. And the reason why they see towns as a better place is because of the apartheid spatial development plan. So as a legal person, how then are you going to make sure, or are you going to advise Parliament when we take our decision to deal with this matter? Last question. I want to check your affiliation. You said you are representing plus minus 1,200 members. Can you,
Honorable Fitan,
yeah, whatever number.
the chance is yours now.
In terms of race, can you analyze to us, can you tell us how many black people are in your association and how many, not necessarily in numbers, you can make a rough estimate of percentage,
Thank
and
you,
how
Honorable
many whites?
Honorable Fitan.
Thank you, Chair. Does international law override our constitution? That's my first question. Simple as all that. Such that we would sacrifice complying with our constitution just so that we honor an international agreement. That's the purpose of the question. Second one is, would you agree with me, we're talking now in the context of budget, which you said is very, very small. Would you agree with me that you're looking at this budget only and exclusively from the perspective of land acquisition as well as land reform, that is programs that help people, as different from the right to own land, pure restitution without paying anything? So you're looking at it purely from saying to purchase so much land, your budget as government is too small. You're not looking at it from the perspective of advancing pure cause of restitution, which could require zero budget. That's why I'm asking you whether you would agree with me that it's because you're looking at the purchase price. Thirdly, you're talking about the fact that property ownership is undermined. Now, you probably know that there's very few people who own large amounts of land and many people who own very little or no land at all. Now, would you agree with me when I say that this is a totally selfish protection of the minority rights or right to own land vis-a-vis the grand or necessary ownership of land by the majority of South Africans? Would you agree with me that you're just looking at it from the perspective of the few who own land? Understanding, because you went further to say this has got a negative impact on the economy, understanding that the economy is driven or is influenced to a large extent by an asset known as land. In other words, whichever way, it has got consequences. Lastly, Chair, very brief one. Very, very brief. Thank you, Chair. Has it ever occurred to you that one of the reasons why people choose cash over land when it comes to restitution is because of a deeply eroded culture of cultivating land, something that stretches for centuries? Has it ever occurred to you that that could be one of the reasons, or are you just simplifying such a fundamentally deep wound that people have lost the culture of cultivating, hence they opt for cash?
Thank you, Honorable Filton. I think Honorable Mukwele also posed on that particular question. I understand. Smith?
Thanks, Chair. Let me start on that one with another different version as well. Sir, you know, you on page 5, although it's not marked, you say, you talk about the 92% that choose cash, and you make a bold statement. This shouldn't come as much of a surprise because money translates to freedom. I would argue that that is absolutely not true. The entire struggle in this country for freedom was about land. That's the point that I'm making, that it was about land, it was not about money. And secondly, sir, I think the real reason why we are asking about access to land is about the dignity. When we went around the country, people spoke about their dignity. So don't reduce this exercise to money, because money can never buy the dignity of many farm workers who can't bury or whose ancestors' burial places have been taken by mines. So don't reduce it to freedom. That's the first point that I want to make. The second point, sir, the gentleman that is just sitting down there now is a retired attorney, I think, from the High Court. And he came to say to us a few minutes ago that, you see, you don't need to change the constitution because Mashaba in Johannesburg is expropriating and everybody else. You come to us and you say to us to do that will flout international law. So are you suggesting to us that Mashaba and Zilla are flouting international law? Thanks, Chair.
Okay. The Vusto. Mr. Justo. We are done with you, Ms. Okay. Johannesburg Attorneys, can you respond?
Yes, okay. So let's look at this question around dignity and freedom. So I think one of the advantages of money is that it can be used to purchase land, but it can be used to purchase any number of things. So in other words, it is a more fungible asset class than land. So in other words, if someone says, I want land, they may not want land in the middle of the Northern Cape. They may want land in a place that they're choosing. And so one of the reasons why people have chosen, as I say, in 92% of cases, money instead of a particular piece of land is because it gives them that freedom to pick whatever they want. And it may be that they would like land, they just want it somewhere else. You raise another important point, which is that sometimes that specific land really matters. Because, as you say, there's a burial ground there, or there's some other intimate connection with that particular piece of land. And I think as far as possible in the restitution process, that land should be restored to that person. But when we look at this question of dignity, it cuts across both lines. In other words, if we have someone who legitimately owns land, and the state takes it from them without paying them anything for it, there has been an invasion of their dignity. And this will cut across color lines. So if the recommended change is to cohere with the rest of our constitution, bear in mind that Section 1 of our constitution says that South Africa is a nation founded on the value of non-racialism, that any change to the constitution will then be done in a non-racial manner. What it does is that it jeopardizes rich people, poor people, black people, and white people. In other words, all of them will be endangered by the state. All of them can have their land taken from them with no compensation. With regards to when you could pay a zero compensation, and in our submission we say that the current constitution allows for the payment of zero compensation in some cases. So, for example, the Mashaba's powers in the city. So what we know is that the starting point is what is the market value? And then you can adjust up or down. So, for example, you may have something that has no market value, given the size of the land or the location of the land. In other words, in that case, just on that factor alone, you could pay zero. You may also find that the nature in which it was acquired. So, for example, case was given of if a piece of land was directly stolen. Well, then I think you have all the reason in the world to pay zero compensation. If someone directly stole something from you, you don't compensate them for it. But this is a point that I think needs to be elaborated on properly. So if we have the case that was illustrated, which is that property is stolen by someone, you can identify who it was, then they must return it, and they must not receive any compensation whatsoever. But if we have a different case, so I'll go through a couple of different degrees of complexity, and also we must bear in mind that South Africa can look abroad to other countries who've had to deal with this problem. So, for example, Germany engages in a compensation process for land that was stolen from Jews by Nazis. And we know that they say if you were a direct thief, in other words, if you were a Nazi, we're not going to pay you anything. That would be unjust to pay anything. We're going to restore the property without compensation. That's just, and our constitution allows that. However, it gets more complicated if you are someone who purchased that property many degrees down the line. So, in other words, you had no knowledge of the theft. Maybe you've even bought a portion of it, and it was retransferred and retransferred and retransferred. You are an innocent bystander. Now, I think it's important as well when we look at this case that we don't say, well, you look like a perpetrator and you look like a victim because of your race, and therefore the transfer should be done on that basis. In other words, we cannot make these broad claims that white people stole the land and black people must be the beneficiaries. What we must look at is individuals that stole the land and individuals that were stolen from, and justice must be done between those two sets of people. So the idea that we could say that all people who have a particular level of melanin in their skin are equally vicious and equally land thieves, well, that goes against what our constitution demands, which is this value of non-racialism. So, for example, there's going to be an enormous amount of difference between people in this country who fled Nazis, like my grandparents who came to this country in 1933 with the clothes on their back. People who have arrived in this country from various different parts of the world with, pray to different gods, speak different languages, all who happen to have the same level of melanin. To clump them together as land thieves would be inappropriate. With regards to, as I said, this idea of minority protections, well, we
On a
ought to
point
care.
of order, Chair. Or a point of privilege, whatever order or privilege that you can give me.
On which point?
Because
On which point?
I don't know whether it will be a privilege or it will be a, no. I want to check with the presenter when he's presenting. He alluded that when they deal with the case of theft, there is a process that they follow. Now, in this case, there is a property that was stolen from the majority of people, and there is evidence to that, to say plot 175, I'm giving an example. These are the beneficiaries of this plot. It's effect Renali, Mabitla, and other things that is in that plot. It was taken, when you follow the history, people will give you how was it taken. And then when he give a narrative to say people bought land, we can still argue, Chair, that everybody who came looking the same as he looks to South Africa, he never brought any land with. So those ones are the ones that are regarded as land thieves.
Can I assist the situation? I don't think it will be fair to engage on that issue because it appears to be a point of debate. And the gentleman from the Johannesburg Attorneys is trying to respond to questions from members. And whatever that point was, let's park it, Honorable Mukwele, and give the gentleman opportunity to continue.
I'll turn to some of the questions regarding international law. So, as I say, what we have is a situation which is that all states are granted the power to expropriate. And in terms of international law, the question is that you must pay appropriate compensation. Now, states are given some latitude to determine what appropriate compensation is, and our state, for example, has set that out in our constitution. So we know how this process will be done, and that there is a fact-finding mission in regards to each particular case. You work out, what is this worth, how is it acquired, what is it going to be used for. We also, our courts make use of a thing called the Pont-Gord principle, which is the idea that if you have the state seeking to expropriate land from a landowner, that's what they could do is say, well, let me drive up the price dramatically because I know the state wants this. And so they artificially inflate it because of artificial demand. And the Pont-Gord principle says, no, you can't do that. We must look at the value of the land aside from the question of whether we're expropriating or not. So you look at the ordinary market value. And then again, we can use all these other factors, which are good, just factors, to determine whether compensation will be due. So in the case, for example, which Mashaba has talked about, is this idea of looking at inner city buildings that have been abandoned. One way in which you could pay 0 rands in compensation is to use the Constitution. So to say, well, is there any debt owned on this building? So if you've had a building that's been abandoned in the inner city for 20 years, it may be that the rates owned on that building outstrip its value, in which case the state can expropriate and pay 0 compensation because it is owed more than the value of the land. So doing so in such an instance would be appropriate compensation and would not be a flouting of international law. However, if there is a piece of land that is valuable, that was justly acquired, then to pay 0 compensation in that instance would not be just and equitable in terms of our constitution. It would not be appropriate in terms of international law. That person is innocent, their dignity would be impinged upon by the state if their land was taken and they were given nothing for it. It would ultimately amount to some sort of state-sanctioned theft. And we know, as I've alluded to, that we have this dark history of land theft in this country for a very long time, and that the law has been used as a weapon against citizens to take their land. It has been used as a weapon against poor, vulnerable black citizens for a long time. We look at the Group Areas Act, we know that that was a complete injustice. People were wrongly deprived of their land. And what we need to do as South Africans is say, never again shall the poor and the vulnerable be subject to the demands of the state and for the law to be utilized against them to perpetrate further injustice. It's important that the law is used in a just manner. Now, on this point as well, I think it's important that when drafting the law, we must bear in mind that positions of power change over time. So, for example, in America, Republicans and Democrats change office on a very frequent basis. And they always bear in mind that the remedies that they craft in law are like weapons which can be used against them by their opponents across the aisle. And of course, this must be borne in mind by all parliamentarians, that if the Constitution is changed, if the Bill of Rights is changed for the first time ever to allow for expropriation without compensation, there is no guarantee that in the future, even if now those that make that change have very just ends in mind, that it will be done so in the future.
Can you maybe, in the interest of time, just wrap up in a minute?
Beg your pardon?
Just wrap up maybe in a minute, because I think we are doing very bad for time.
Yes, yes, I understand.
And as indicated earlier on, if there are other further submissions that you can always do that in writing. Just let me just give you a minute to wrap up.
I appreciate that. So I will say that there is this concern that if a change is made, it'll be utilized as a weapon against those that want to use it for good, and that is something that must be borne in mind. We do know that South Africa is governed by a multiple range of different political parties who may use it in all sorts of ways. It will not always be the noble that expropriate. They may use it as a weapon to punish people who don't share their political views or their ethnic backgrounds. That must be borne in mind. With regard to the concerns about breaching international law, well, what we may have is a situation of South Africa being taken to international tribunals if land is taken without appropriate compensation, so there will be those sanctions. There may also be a pariah status attached to the country, which South Africa has had before in the eyes of the international community, and we would not like that again. So you may have a situation where we are cut out from the international community because we are not respecting international law, and that is something to be avoided. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We appreciate that you took your time to come and reach us with your deliberations. Thank you so much.